The well spoke before anything else did. A low, metallic groan, the kind a pipe makes when pressure shifts deep underground, broke across the Wyoming dark like a bone snapping in an empty church. Clara Vance heard it from her bed. She had been awake anyway. She was always awake at that hour, lying flat on her back with her eyes fixed on the ceiling and her hands folded across her chest like a woman already rehearsing for burial. Then came the sound beneath the groan. Hooves. Slow. Uneven. Something large and desperate, moving toward water. Clara sat up. Before we go any further, pause for just a second. This woman, this land, this well, they are all connected by something that happened 2 years before this night. Something that was called an accident. Something that was ruled an accident. Something that everyone in Larimer County agreed, out loud and in paperwork, was definitely an accident. Clara never believed a single word of that. And tonight, an animal that should not exist. A horse that carries proof of crimes that powerful men buried alongside a charred body. Found the only clean water left in 60 square miles. Think about what that means. Think about who sent him. Think about what he's carrying. If you believe the truth always finds a way to run free, leave that in the comments. Tell me your city. And stay. Because what happens in the next hour will change the way you think about silence, water, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. The Vance property sat at the eastern skirt of the Medicine Bow Range like something the mountains had exhaled and forgotten about. 1,400 acres of high desert scrub, cut through by a single seasonal creek that had run dry for the second year in a row, bookended by rocky outcrops to the west and flat, punishing plains to the east that stretched into a darkness so complete it seemed less like night and more like the edge of existence itself. There were no neighbors within 4 miles. The nearest town, Harlan's Fork, population 900 on a good census year, was 22 miles down a Tulane state road that buckled every spring and never got repaired until summer was already dying. The gas station there doubled as the post office. The post office doubled as a place where men talked without women present, and decisions got made without the pretense of democracy. Clara had lived here all her life. She had been born in the back bedroom of the main house, delivered by a midwife because the roads were frozen and her father refused to leave his herd unattended in a blizzard. She had learned to ride before she could read. She had learned to read from her mother, who believed that a woman without books was a woman without weapons. She had buried both parents in the small fenced plot behind the east pasture, marked by 2 flat stones and a single stunted juniper that bent permanently westward from decades of wind. She had married Daniel Vance at 23, a quiet man from a ranching family 2 counties over who had the rare quality of knowing when to speak and when to simply stand beside someone in the dark. They had built the property into something real together, not wealthy, never wealthy, but functional and proud. They had repaired the main house twice, dug a second well when the first ran low, added a diesel generator when the grid proved unreliable, expanded the barn. The barn was gone now. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days ago, at approximately 2 in the morning, the main barn had burned to the ground in what the Larimer County Fire Marshal ruled an accidental ignition, most likely caused by a lantern left too close to a hay bale. The barn had been locked. Daniel did not use lanterns. He had switched to battery-powered work lights 4 years prior because of exactly this kind of risk. Daniel had been inside the barn when it burned. The official account was that he had gone out to check on a sick mare, taken a lantern from a hook near the door out of habit, and the rest was tragedy. The official account did not explain why the lock on the barn's exterior hasp had been found in the closed position after the fire, which meant the door had been locked from the outside. The official account did not explain the chemical accelerant residue that Clara's own nose had detected in the first minutes, before the fire trucks arrived, before anyone official was present to tell her what she was and was not smelling. The official account had been authored, in large part, by Sheriff Gideon Sterling. Clara had known Gideon since they were children. He and Daniel had gone to school together. He had been a pallbearer at their wedding, standing straight and formal in a borrowed suit, his face carrying the careful expression of a man performing a role he had rehearsed. She had trusted him because Daniel trusted him, and because in a place this isolated, trust was not optional. It was infrastructure. That trust had curdled slowly, the way milk does in heat. Not all at once. In stages. First when he failed to order a proper arson investigation. Then when he suggested, gently, that Clara might want to consider selling the property to avoid the estate tax complications that would arise from Daniel's death without a clear will. Then when she discovered, through a conversation she was not meant to overhear at the Harlan's Fork gas station, that Gideon Sterling sat on the advisory board of the Ironwood Agricultural Partnership, the same consortium of large landholders that had been quietly acquiring small ranches across 4 counties for the past 3 years. The Vance property had the best artesian well in the region. Everyone knew it. In a landscape where water was the only currency that actually mattered, the Vance well was a fortune buried in the earth. Deep, clean, cold, and reliable even in drought years when every other surface source dried to cracked mud. Clara had not sold. She had instead accumulated debt, stretched her remaining cattle operation thin, repaired what she could repair herself, and watched the property shrink in ways that weren't visible on a map but were visible in her body, in the slope of her shoulders, in the new lines around her mouth, in the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window at dusk and looked at the horizon with an expression that had no name in English. Not grief, not rage, something older. The kind of feeling a person carries when they know the truth but cannot prove it, and the world keeps moving forward anyway. She was 55 years old. She had a rifle she kept loaded by the back door, a savings account that would last another 8 months at current expenditure, and a stubbornness so fundamental it had become indistinguishable from her skeleton. The well groan came again. And then the hoofbeats, closer now. She was already reaching for her boots. The night outside was clear and pitiless. Clara stepped off the back porch into air that carried the particular cold of high desert at 3 in the morning. Not winter cold, not wet cold, but the dry mineral cold of a landscape that released its heat quickly and completely, as if warmth were something it had only borrowed and was returning with interest. The stars above were extravagant. The kind of sky you only saw this far from any city, so dense with light, it looked almost solid. She carried a flashlight she did not turn on. The well and its pump housing were 40 yards from the back of the house, enclosed by a low wooden fence that kept livestock from damaging the pump casing. The pipeline that ran from the well split at a manifold, one branch to the house, one to the main trough in the east pasture, one to an auxiliary line that fed the smaller troughs nearer the outbuildings. Since the barn fire, the east pasture line had been shut off. There was nothing left in the east pasture to water. She heard the horse before she saw it. The breathing was wrong. Too fast, too ragged, with a catch in it on every exhale that told her immediately the animal was not simply tired. It was damaged. It had been running not towards something but away from something, and the difference between those two states leaves different marks on a living creature's body. She stopped walking and listened. The horse was on the near side of the well fence, trying to reach over it. She could hear the scrape of its chest against the wooden rail, the desperate stretching. The trough on the inside of the fence was dry. She had not filled it in weeks. The pump was off. Whatever water was left in the line had long since evaporated. Clara made a decision in the time it takes to breathe once. She walked to the generator shed, which was 30 feet to the left of the well housing, and she pulled the choke and turned the key. The diesel generator coughed, shuddered, and caught. A modest run of lights came on along the back fence line, not bright, just enough to see. She turned around. The horse stood at the fence and looked at her. He was black, not dark bay, not seal brown. Black the way iron is black, the way deep water is black, the way the space between stars is black. Even at this distance, even in this light, she could see that he was magnificent. 16 hands at least, probably more. Heavy through the chest and shoulder, with legs built for sustained speed rather than quick bursts. A neck that arched even in exhaustion. Eyes that caught the generator light and gave it back in 2 steady amber gold points. He did not bolt when the generator started. He watched her. That told her something. A truly wild animal would have run at the sound. A truly feral animal would have at least shifted back from the fence. This horse had been around people, had been worked, knew what machinery sounded like. But he had also been running hard enough to soak himself through. She could see the dried foam on his neck and flanks from 15 feet away, could smell the salt and heat of him on the still air. She opened the gate. He stepped back once, watching her, and then was still. She walked to the pump housing and opened the manual bypass valve that let her run the trough line without pressurizing the full system. Water moved through the pipe with a low gurgle. The near trough began to fill. The horse walked in through the open gate and drank. He drank for a long time. She stood back and let him, watching the muscle of his throat work, watching his body begin to settle, the frantic breathing slowing, the set of his ears going from flat and tight to upright and almost relaxed. She had seen horses drink after hard runs before. This was more than that. This was an animal that had genuinely not known if it would find water and was now drinking with the specific quality of relief that only exists when the alternative was death. When he lifted his head, she approached him slowly from the side and slightly behind, the way you approach any horse you do not know, announcing yourself through movement rather than sound. She ran her hand along his neck. He shivered once, then allowed it. That was when she found the marks. Around his neck, worn into the coat, were rope burns. Not old ones. Recent. The kind left by a lead rope tied too tight on a struggling animal. The skin beneath had been rubbed raw in 2 places, and one of them was still seeping a thin line of blood that had dried dark against the black coat. She kept her hand steady, moved down his shoulder, down his side. The brand on his left flank was a ranch brand she did not recognize, a shape that looked like the letter K or an angular crown. But it was the mark on his right flank, lower, near the hip, that made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. Fresh, very recent. Applied not with the care of proper ranch branding, but with the hasty pressure of a man who needed something done quickly and did not particularly care about the pain involved. A shape like a key, but inverted, pointing down. Clara had seen that shape before. She knew exactly where she had seen it. But that knowledge did not arrive fully formed in that moment. It arrived as a feeling first, the way deep memories always do. A cold pressure behind the sternum. A sudden certainty that this animal standing in her flashlight beam, drinking from her well in the middle of the night, was not an accident, was not random, was not just a loose horse that had wandered. She cleaned the rope burns with the first aid supplies she kept in the pump house. She applied antibiotic ointment and covered the seeping one with a clean wrap. The horse stood for all of it with the patience of an animal that had been handled with care before and remembered what that felt like. When she was done, she led him around the side of the house to the smaller outbuilding she used for equipment storage, the one with concrete floors and a reinforced door, the one she thought of privately as the storm room because she had sheltered there twice in her life during tornadoes. She put down fresh straw from the bale she kept for mulching. She filled a bucket with water from the house tap. She latched the door from the outside and went back to bed. She did not sleep. Dawn in Wyoming did not arrive gently. It came like an accusation, a hard line of orange lights slicing across the eastern plain without any of the softness that dawn carried in gentler landscapes. It came fast and honest and absolutely without compromise, the way truth comes when it has been kept waiting too long. Clara heard the engines before she saw the light. Not one engine. Many. The low, layered rumble of diesel trucks. The kind with oversized tires and aftermarket exhaust systems. The kind driven by men who wanted to sound larger than they were. She counted 4 distinct engine tones from her bedroom before she got to the window. By the time she reached the glass, she had lost count. They were everywhere. Pickups lined the fence line on the south pasture side, their headlights still on despite the growing morning light, cutting white beams across her dry grass. More vehicles on the north side, half of them backed in, which meant they had reversed deliberately to face outward, the position of men who intended to stay and had thought about their exit. And on the east side, nearest the well, the mounted riders. She counted 11 horses before she stopped counting, all of them held by men with rifles across their saddles, or rifles slung over their shoulders, or rifles resting across their knees. All of them facing her house with the particular stillness of people who had rehearsed this and were now executing it. The well. They were all oriented toward the well. Clara took 3 measured breaths. She thought, they were here before full light. They were positioned before I was awake. This was not a search party. This was not a response to an emergency. This was a deployment. Someone had known the horse was here before the horse arrived, or someone had been tracking him. She moved away from the window without touching the curtain, got dressed in the dark without the lights, pulled on her boots, her canvas jacket, and stood in the center of her kitchen with her hands at her sides, feeling the geometry of the situation arrange itself in her mind with the clarity that comes only when the danger is finally visible instead of suspected. There was a knock at the door, not a polite knock, not 3 evenly spaced taps. This was a flat, authoritative blow, the knock of a person who did not expect to be refused entry and wanted you to know that from the first sound. Clara opened it. Gideon Sterling stood on her porch in his full uniform, his badge catching the early light. He was 61 years old and carried himself like a man who had been large once and was now simply wide, the authority of former size, maintained through posture rather than presence. His hat was on. His hands were at his belt. His face carried the expression she had come to recognize over 2 years of hostile contact, the carefully arranged look of a man performing reasonableness for an audience that did not exist. Behind him, across the yard, the mounted men waited. "Clara," he said. "Good morning." She said nothing. "There's been a report," he continued, "of a stolen horse. A valuable animal. Private property, taken from a secure facility and believed to be in this area. We have tracking data that puts it somewhere on your land." She said, "It's early, Gideon." He nodded slowly, as if she had said something profound. "It is. We apologize for the disruption. But this animal is worth a significant sum and belongs to people with significant interest in its recovery. If you could just let us take a look around." She said, "Do you have a warrant?" The expression on his face shifted by a single degree, barely visible. But Clara had been reading Gideon Sterling's face for 40 years, and she caught it. The flicker of something that was not irritation but was related to irritation, the way a cousin is related to a family member who has caused everyone trouble. "You know how this works, Clara. We can do this cooperatively, or we can make it formal. Making it formal takes time and causes problems for everyone. And given your current tax situation, I don't think you want any more problems on paper right now." She looked past him at the mounted men, then at the trucks along the fence lines, then back at him. Without another word, she closed the door and locked it. She heard him exhale sharply through his nose, heard the creak of the porch as he shifted his weight, and then heard him say, quietly but with the precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "You have 10 minutes, Clara. After that, this gets official and ugly. Your choice." She was already moving toward the back of the house. The storm room was accessible from 2 directions, through the internal door off the back hallway, and through an exterior side door that faced the equipment yard. Clara went through the internal door, moving quickly but without the stumbling urgency of panic. The horse heard her coming. She could tell by the shift in his breathing, from the slow rhythm of a resting animal to something slightly elevated, prepared. When she opened the door, he was standing at the far wall with his ears up, watching the entry point with the focused attention of an animal that had survived recent danger and had not yet decided the danger was gone. She stood in the doorway and let him process her presence. After a moment, his ears relaxed by half a degree. She took that as permission and came all the way in. The room smelled of fresh straw and horse and the particular dusty mineral scent of the concrete itself, a smell she associated with safety and emergency, with the 2 times she had crouched here against the earth while the sky above tried to come apart. She moved along his right side, to the mark on his hip. In the full light of the overhead bulb, with her reading glasses on, she could see it clearly now. The burned shape of an inverted key, a bow at the bottom, a shaft pointing upward, a simple cut bit at the top. Applied quickly, irregularly, the edges of the burn uneven in a way that proper branding never was. This had been done by someone in a hurry, with improvised equipment, to mark something they didn't own and didn't want to lose. She straightened up, turned the shape in her mind, and then, with the sudden cold weight of a stone dropped into standing water, she knew where she had seen it. She went to the back hallway. On the high shelf above the coat hooks, behind a cardboard box of old calving records she kept meaning to throw away, was a smaller box, shoebox-sized. She reached it without needing to look. Her hands knew where it was the way her hands knew where everything was in this house, through years of repetition and the particular spatial memory that comes from living in one place long enough. Inside the box were the things she had not been able to turn over to Gideon Sterling's investigation. Not because she had planned to conceal them. She had, initially, intended to hand everything to the fire marshal and trust the process. But then the process had produced its verdict in 11 days, which was impossibly fast, and she had realized she was holding things that would simply disappear into a file that would never be reopened. Among them was a fragment of a metal gallon container, fire-warped but not fully destroyed, that she had found in the debris 3 days after the burn. She had shown it to the fire marshal's assistant, a young man from Cheyenne who had looked at it, made a note, and never followed up. She had asked about it twice. Both times she was told the evidence was being evaluated. She had kept a photograph she had taken before handing over the fragment. On her phone, backed up twice, stored on a USB drive that lived in this box. She plugged the USB into her laptop, pulled up the image, looked at the photograph of the warped, fire-blackened side of the container. There, stamped into the metal, partially melted but still legible, was the same shape, the same inverted key, a manufacturing mark or a brand or a property marker of some kind, pressed into the metal at the base of the handle. The same symbol on the horse's flank was the same symbol on the container that had held the accelerant that burned her barn. That killed Daniel. Clara sat down on the floor of the back hallway and placed her back against the wall and breathed through it. Not tears. She was past tears, had been past tears for almost a year. This was something else, something that moved through her chest like a current, a kind of electrical coldness that was not grief and not rage, but the specific sensation of a truth arriving fully, finally, with evidence attached. They had come back. Whatever organization, whatever group, whatever brand that inverted key represented, they had returned to her property. Not in fire this time. In the form of an animal they had marked and caged and lost. An animal that had run toward the one thing they most wanted to control. Her water. She stood up. She went back to the storm room, and she looked at the horse for a long time. And the horse looked at her, and between them passed something that was not communication in any language either of them possessed, but was nevertheless perfectly clear. From outside, through the thick concrete walls, she could hear engines idling, voices, the occasional distant shout of a man giving instruction, the creak and stamp of mounted horses growing restless, the sounds of an encirclement being maintained. And then Gideon's voice, amplified now through a vehicle loudspeaker, crossing the distance from the front of the house to the back. "Clara, time's up. We're coming in on a public safety basis. Step outside with the animal, or we'll be forced to breach the property." She ignored it. She went back to her laptop and pulled up the county property records, the ones she had spent months slowly assembling, cross-referenced with water authority filings, with the irrigation district reports she had formally requested and been given in heavily redacted form, with the geological survey records that told the story of the aquifer beneath her land. She knew what she was looking for now. She had always known where to look. She had just not had the final piece. The inverted key. She typed the phrase into the property records search field as a notation query, looking for any filing, any covenant, any easement, any registration that contained a variation of that phrase or symbol. The result that came back made her stop breathing for the second time that night. Ironwood Agricultural Conservancy, Restricted Water Access Covenant, Secondary Designation Marker, Inverted Keystone. Filed 16 months ago. Filed, she noted, for months after Daniel died. They had filed the paperwork while the ashes were still cooling. She had maybe 4 minutes before Gideon made good on his threat. She used them carefully. The Ironwood filing was dense. 47 pages of legal language designed to obscure rather than communicate, the kind of document written by attorneys who were paid to make sure no one, without a law degree, could understand what was being agreed to. But Clara had spent 2 years reading every document she could find related to her land and the surrounding properties, and she had learned, out of necessity, to read legal agricultural language the way you read weather, not for the precise words, but for the shape of what was moving. What she found, in the covenant's secondary annexes, was a set of water access restrictions that had been recorded against 4 small ranches in the county, including her own, based on a contamination assessment conducted by an unnamed third-party environmental contractor. The assessment claimed that the aquifer underlying these properties had been compromised by naturally occurring mineral intrusion and was no longer suitable for livestock use. The covenant restricted the owner's ability to sell water rights or access new drilling permits. Naturally occurring. She thought about the dry creek beds, the dead cattle on 2 neighboring properties over the past year, blamed on parasites, blamed on poor feed, never fully investigated. She thought about the Garza family, 3 ranches to the north, who had sold out 18 months ago after their water tested positive for something their well company called mineral contamination. She thought about the Hendersons, who had simply left without selling, abandoning a 3-generation property and never explaining why. Naturally occurring did not explain why the Vance well. the deepest, the most isolated, the one that drew from a deeper stratum than any of the neighboring properties, was still clean. It was clean because whatever had been introduced into the shallower aquifer layers had not yet reached this depth. But it would, eventually, if the contamination source continued, unless the source was identified and stopped. She minimized the property records and pulled up the county assessor's GIS maps, overlaid the Ironwood property holdings, overlaid the contamination assessment zones, overlaid the locations of the 4 ranches named in the covenant. The pattern that appeared was not subtle. The Ironwood holdings surrounded the contaminated zone like a frame surrounds a painting. They owned everything adjacent to the affected area. The small ranches were inside the frame, being systematically devalued by water problems that had not existed 5 years ago, their owners selling out to Ironwood at depressed prices because they had no other option. The Vance well sat at the center of the map like a pivot point. If you controlled the Vance well, you controlled the last clean source in a region where the shallow aquifer was being slowly poisoned. You controlled the price of water for the whole Eastern Valley. You controlled which operations could survive and which couldn't. You controlled everything. Daniel had figured this out. He had written it down somewhere. He had been killed before he could prove it. The horse had been kept at whatever facility Ironwood was using, probably under a false conservation banner, probably on one of their larger properties, and had carried or been near the evidence. The chip. She didn't know exactly what the chip held, but the fact that these men had mobilized before sunrise with armed riders to retrieve a single horse told her everything she needed to know about how dangerous that chip's contents were to them. The loudspeaker crackled again. Gideon's voice, harder now. "Clara, this is your final warning. Open the front door and bring the animal out, or we will be entering the property by force in 60 seconds. She closed the laptop. She stood up straight. And for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days, the grief in her chest, that cold, shapeless, nameless grief that had lived there since the night the barn burned, converted, transformed, became something with edges, something useful. She walked to the front door and placed her hand on the lock. She did not open it. They came around the house, not through the door, around it, riders moving along both flanks, appearing in the narrow windows as shapes against the hard morning light, and then disappearing again as they moved to position themselves at the back. She could hear the creak and snap of her fence rails being pushed aside by truck bumpers, the metallic protest of the post-in wire that she had run by hand after the cattle operation shrank to nothing, fence line that had taken her 3 weekends to complete alone. The sound of it breaking was specific and personal, the way the breaking of something you built yourself always is. She did not move from the hallway. Judd Harrison arrived through the front gate on a gray horse that was too large for his frame. A deliberate choice, she thought. The way everything Judd did was deliberate. He was 64 years old and built like the kind of man who had been powerful physically in his youth and had since converted that physicality into something subtler and more dangerous. He wore no visible firearm, which meant he had someone else carrying his violence for him, which was exactly how he preferred things. He stopped his horse in the middle of her front yard and did not call out. He simply waited, the way men of his type wait, with the absolute confidence that eventually the world will come to them, because it always has. The truck that pulled up beside him had Ironwood Agricultural Partnership decals on the door panels. 2 men climbed out of the bed, and between them, they carried equipment she recognized, fiber optic cable probe gear, the kind used for deep well inspection. They were planning to go into the well before they even had the horse secured. They were not here for the horse. The horse was an excuse. Clara watched all of this from the narrow side window in the kitchen, standing back far enough that she was a shadow rather than a target. She watched Gideon Sterling ride up beside Judd and lean over to say something she couldn't hear. She watched Judd respond with a single dismissive gesture, a small sideways cut of the hand that said, "Move forward." Gideon straightened up and turned his horse toward the house. "Clara," he called out, "I want you to understand something. No one here wants to see you harmed. This is a property compliance matter. A stolen animal was brought onto your land, and that makes you a party to the theft whether you knew about it or not. The easiest resolution here is for you to open up, let us collect the animal, and we can handle the rest quietly." She noticed he did not mention the well equipment. She noticed Judd Harrison was already walking toward the pump housing. She went to the back hallway and opened the internal door to the storm room. The horse lifted his head at the sound of her entry. She stood in the doorway and took a moment. She did not technically have to press her forehead against the door frame and close her eyes. Daniel had known. He had written it down. He had died for it. And this animal had come to the last clean water in the county on the same night. She was one missed property tax payment from losing it all. She opened her eyes. She went back to the small box on the shelf and removed the USB drive. She plugged it into her phone, transferred the photograph of the burned container with the inverted key symbol. She sent it to 3 places: to her attorney's email, to the state environmental agency's tip line that she had bookmarked 8 months ago without yet using, and to a journalist in Cheyenne who had written 2 pieces about water rights consolidation in the region and who had given Clara her card at a public meeting 14 months ago with the words, "If you ever have something solid, call me." She typed the message fast. Ironwood. Aquifer contamination. Armed men on my property right now. Inverted key symbol. Same mark on horse, they're trying to recover. Send someone. She hit send on all 3. Then she walked to the internal doorway that connected the storm room to the main house's lower utility corridor, and she found the thing she had not told anyone about, not even her attorney. The thing she had found when she was cleaning 2 months after Daniel died, when she had torn apart the lower level of the house looking for something, anything, that would make the grief feel productive rather than just hollow. Behind the false back panel of the old root cellar shelf, the one Daniel had built himself, the one that backed against the east foundation wall, was a narrow space, deliberately created, that held a weatherproofed canvas roll. Inside the roll, a field journal. Daniel's handwriting. She had found it before. She had opened it once, seen his handwriting on the first page, and put it away because she had not been ready, had not been strong enough for what his voice in written form would do to her. She was ready now. From outside, the sound of engines shifting, moving closer, and then, unmistakably, the heavy metallic thud of something blunt hitting the front door. They had started on the door. She opened the journal. His handwriting was angular and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who thought carefully before he wrote, who considered words as tools with weights and cutting edges. She had always loved his handwriting. It had always seemed like him. She turned past the early pages, field notes, cattle records, dates, and numbers, until she found the section that had been written in a different pen, a darker ink, on pages that had been compressed more tightly than the rest, as if he had been writing in a hurry and pressing harder than usual. The first line she found stopped her cold. He had written, "They contaminated the North Line wells in March. I confirmed it with the test kit from the state extension office. The levels are wrong. Someone put something in the aquifer upstream of the Garza property." She turned the page. He had documented 4 separate water tests, dates and results written out in his careful hand. He had sketched a rough map of the aquifer drainage pattern, with arrows showing directional flow. He had circled one point on the map, on the ironwood holdings to the northwest of her property, and written beside it, "Source? Access road visible from highway marker 17, new pipe installation, no visible permit." He had written, "Clara cannot know yet. She will try to act immediately, and they will see it coming. I need the proof airtight before we move." She understood why he had kept it from her. She did not like it, but she understood it. He had been protecting her the way you protect someone from a risk you haven't yet mapped fully, not from distrust, but from the knowledge that incomplete information leads to incomplete action and incomplete action leads to catastrophe. He had also, she realized, underestimated how fast they would move. She turned to the last entries. February 14th, 2 days before the fire. He had written, "Judd Harrison approached me at the feed store. Very friendly. Offered to buy the well rights outright, separate from the property. Said it would solve our tax problems and I could keep working the land. I declined." He smiled the whole time. February 15th. Received a call from Gideon. He asked if I would consider listing the property with the county land bank. I said no. He said he was asking as a friend and that he hoped I understood his position was complicated. And then, in different ink, written over the top of the entry as an addendum, in letters pressed so hard they had nearly torn the page, "If they come for the well, the truth is protected in the land. Look below the east wall." She looked up from the journal. She was in the root cellar. She was against the east wall. She had found this exact space, this exact hiding place, because she had been looking. She ran her hand along the base of the east wall where it met the floor. The concrete was uneven, not from settling. Concrete settled in specific ways she recognized from decades of living with it. This unevenness was intentional. She found the edge of a mortared patch, a section that had been broken out and then resealed, less than a year before Daniel died, based on the color differential. She looked around the room, found the pry bar she kept in the corner, worked the edge of the patch. It came away in two pieces. Beneath it, sealed in a heavy waterproof plastic case, was a hard drive. And taped to the outside of the case in Daniel's handwriting was a single line: satellite tracking data, contamination events, GPS evidence. All of it. She held it in her hands for a moment that existed outside of time. From the front of the house, the door cracked. Not broken through yet, but cracked, the frame giving under repeated impact. She had minutes, maybe less. She thought about the choice with the brutal clarity of someone who had been building toward it for 2 years without knowing it. She could open the door, hand over the horse, give Judd Harrison what he had come for, or let him take it and walk away. The tax pressure would ease. Gideon had as much as promised it. She would have the land. She would have the well. She would survive in the narrowest, most technical sense of that word. She would do it by letting the men who killed Daniel walk away with the thing that proved it. She would do it by choosing her own comfort over the 4 other families who had been driven off their land, over the Garzas, over the Hendersons, over every small operation in this valley that had been slowly strangled by poison water that no one with authority was willing to call poison. She would do it by spending the rest of her life sleeping next to the knowledge that she had been given the truth, had literally held it in her hands, and had handed it back to the people who had buried it. Or she could hide the hard drive. She could use what she had already sent. She could use Daniel's journal. She could use the photograph of the burned container. She could use the horse, whose microchip, if it existed and if it contained what she believed it did, was either in a saddlebag somewhere along whatever route he had run, or built into him in a location she hadn't yet checked. She checked. She ran her hands along the horse's neck, behind his ears, down his crest. And there, just below the left ear, she felt the small firm rectangle of an implanted transponder. Not a standard livestock chip, something larger, something with more data capacity, the kind that wildlife management programs used for remote satellite monitoring. The chip was in the horse. It had always been in the horse. Everything Judd Harrison had done since dawn was to prevent this chip from being read by anyone outside his control. She put the hard drive in her jacket's interior pocket. She put the journal in after it. She looked at the horse. She made her choice. It was not a choice she made easily. It was not a choice she made without cost. She made it fully aware that in the next few minutes she might be arrested, her property might be seized, and every fragile legal thread she had been maintaining might snap at once. She made it because Daniel had made it first, and he had not been given the chance to see it through. She intended to see it through. She opened the valve. The artesian well beneath the Vance property drew from a formation 1,200 feet below the surface, in a stratum of fractured limestone that held pressure the way a fist holds something it refuses to let go. The pressure relief system had been installed by Daniel in the 2nd year of their marriage, a safety mechanism to prevent surface rupture during high recharge events, with manual override valves set at intervals along the external pipe run. Clara had helped him install it. She knew it better than he had. She went to the exterior wall access panel in the storm room's utility corridor, the section of pipe that ran along the east foundation before going underground toward the pasture troughs. She located the primary relief valve, opened it a quarter turn and felt the pipe shiver, opened it another quarter turn and heard the deep underground sound begin. That low, ascending moan that meant pressure was reading the opening and moving toward it. She opened it fully. The pipe at the exterior manifold, 40 feet away and connected to the same line, did not simply release water. It erupted. The pressure behind an artesian formation at 1,200 feet, in a year of full subterranean recharge, is not something that moves politely. The water came up through the relief coupling like a fist through wet paper. A solid column of water, stone grit, and mineral sediment that hit the ground and immediately spread in every direction with the force of something that had been held down for a very long time and was now, definitively, done. She heard the shouts begin immediately. A horse screamed, not in pain, but in sudden terror at the impact of the water, the ground-shaking vibration, the noise. Then another. Then the sound of men falling, the crack of boots on wet earth, the confusion of voices trying to organize against something they had not planned for. She moved fast through the internal corridor to the back door, staying low. Through the small back window, she could see the yard, and it was chaos. Riders were down, their horses wheeling away from the water plume that had turned the packed earth yard into a wet, slick, churning mess of mud and flying stones. 2 trucks had their windshields opaqued with mud. The well equipment that Judd's men had been setting up was knocked sideways, the cable probes spinning in the water and creating a secondary hazard as it whipped through the space. Judd Harrison's gray horse had deposited him on the ground and was now standing 10 yards away, refusing to come back. She saw Gideon Sterling pull his horse in a tight circle, his hat gone, his uniform soaked, his carefully arranged expression completely destroyed. He was shouting into a radio. She could not hear the words. She went to the storm room. The horse was already alert, ears forward, nostrils wide, processing the sounds of the chaos outside with the focused attention of an animal deciding whether to move or hold. She unlatched the exterior side door that faced the equipment yard, the narrow door that connected to the south side of the property, away from the main chaos, toward the back fence line and the county road beyond it. She opened the door wide. She stepped aside. The horse did not need instruction. He walked to the opening, assessed the space outside with a single long look, and then moved, from walk to trot to canter in the space of 3 strides, flowing through the gate gap with the particular efficiency of an animal that had survived by moving well. He cleared the back fence in a single arc. His hooves hit the road shoulder, and he was running before she could draw another breath. Running north, toward the highway, toward the state trooper patrol route she had memorized, the one that ran the county line 4 days a week, the one that had passed at 6:45 a.m. on 3 of the last 4 Mondays she had been awake early enough to see it. It was 6:41 a.m. She stood in the doorway of the storm room and watched him go, a black shape against the pale morning landscape, growing smaller with each stride, carrying in the chip beneath his skin all the evidence that had been buried and poisoned and burned over. Running free, just as Daniel had intended. The men found her standing in the equipment yard when the water pressure finally dropped to a manageable level. Gideon came around the side of the house first, mud on his face and his uniform, his radio clipped back to his shoulder. 3 of the mounted riders were behind him, their horses calmed now that the water eruption had subsided, but all of them wet and wary and looking at her with the particular expression men wear when they have been humiliated by circumstances and are looking for somewhere to direct the feeling. "You just made a very large mistake," Gideon said. His voice had lost the managed tone of earlier. There was something exposed in it now, not anger exactly, but the thing underneath anger, the thing that anger is a cover for. Fear. The specific fear of a man who has spent years constructing a careful structure and has just heard something crack. Clara looked at him without speaking. Judd Harrison came around the far corner on foot, leading his gray horse by the bridle. He was covered in mud to the shoulder on his right side where he had fallen. His face was absolutely still, not with calm, but with the effort of imposing stillness over something that very much did not want to be still. He was a man who had not been surprised in a long time, and surprise, she could see, sat very badly on him. "Where is the horse?" he said. Not a question, a flat declarative. "Gone," she said. He looked at the open side door, looked at the track the horse had made in the soft earth of the yard, looked at the fence line in the distance, processed the geometry of it. He turned to Gideon and said, "Find it." Gideon turned to relay the order, and that was when they all heard it. A siren, then 2. Then the rhythmic strobing of light bars reflecting off the low clouds to the north, visible even through the morning brightness. A state trooper vehicle came up the access road at speed, followed by a second. Behind them, moving slower, a third vehicle, not law enforcement, but the flat gray sedan of someone who drove deliberately and parked with intention and stepped out with a press badge already visible. The journalist from Cheyenne had come herself. Clara watched Judd Harrison's face in the moment he registered all 3 vehicles. She watched the calculation happen, the rapid assessment of variables, the revision of plans, the shrinkage of options. She watched him understand that the thing he had spent years controlling had broken past the edges of his control in the space of one morning. The lead trooper approached her first. Behind him, She could hear a second officer beginning to ask Gideon Sterling questions in a tone that was professional and even and not at all friendly. "Ma'am, we received a tip about potential criminal activity and an unusual disturbance on this property. Are you all right?" She reached into her jacket, handed him the USB drive with the photographs, told him about the hard drive in her interior pocket, which she then produced, told him about Daniel's field journal, the documented water tests, the dates, the contamination map, the ironwood filing with the inverted key marker. She told him where to look for the original accelerant container fragment in the fire marshal's evidence archive, under a case number that had never been formally closed. She had the case number memorized. She told him about the microchip in the horse. The trooper listened to all of it without interrupting, writing with the methodical pace of someone who understood that what they were being told was going to take a long time to fully process. "Are you injured?" he asked when she finished. She said, "No." "Is there anything else on the property you need us to secure before?" She said, "The well." He nodded. His partner was already walking toward it. The investigation moved faster than she had expected. Not because justice was swift in Larimer County. It was not, had never been, probably would not be in the future in any systematic way. But because the chip embedded beneath the stallion's skin contained not merely tracking data, but a complete geospatial log of every location the horse had been held at over the past 8 months, cross-referenced automatically with the satellite timestamps from the State Ecological Reserves Program. The horse was registered to the Breckenridge State Wildlife Preserve, a protected ecological designation in the neighboring county that held a conserved herd of black Spanish Mustangs under state management. He had been removed from the preserve 9 months ago in what had been recorded as an escape. The preserve had searched for him for 3 weeks and eventually, quietly, removed him from the active roster. He had not escaped. He had been taken. The chip proved it. The chip also proved he had been held, for 8 months, at a facility on Ironwood's northwest property, the same property that sat adjacent to the source point Daniel had circled on his aquifer map, the same location where the unauthorized pipe installation had been observed from Highway Marker 17. The environmental testing that followed was not inconclusive. The State Environmental Agency sent a full technical team within 72 hours of Clara's tip. The aquifer contamination in the shallow layers was confirmed as artificial, specifically, a mix of industrial solvent compounds consistent with improper disposal of drilling waste, introduced at depth over a period of approximately 3 years. It had not occurred naturally. It had been engineered to occur. The source point was on Ironwood land. The contamination radius matched, almost precisely, the properties listed in the Ironwood Covenant, the ones that had been systematically devalued by water problems and sold at Depression-era prices. The Garzas had tested their well and sold because their water was genuinely undrinkable. The Hendersons had left because their cattle had died and they had believed, as they had been led to believe, that it was their fault, their mismanagement, their land. It was not their land. It was their water, and the water had been poisoned on purpose. Daniel's field journal provided 3 years of documented observation that corroborated the technical findings, dates, test results, map sketches that matched the geospatial data almost point for point. A man who had spent his life reading land had read this correctly and had been killed before he could speak. Clara's attorney, working with the state attorney general's office, filed charges within 6 weeks of the initial investigation: criminal contamination of a protected water source, conspiracy to defraud property owners, filing of false environmental assessments, arson with lethal consequence. The arson charge carried Daniel's name in the formal documentation. She read it twice. She folded the paper carefully along its existing crease and placed it in the box with his other things. Gideon Sterling resigned from his position before formal charges were filed, on advice of his attorney. He was charged nonetheless. Judd Harrison made no statement. He was taken from his office at the Ironwood headquarters by federal officers on a Tuesday morning, in full sight of the people who had worked for him, in the specific silence of a man who had always assumed he was beyond this moment. He was not beyond this moment. He had simply been delayed getting to it. The Black Stallion was returned to the Breckenridge Preserve 2 months after the investigation began. He left as he had arrived, under supervision, documented, cared for, a subject of record. But she had seen him once more before he went. They had brought him by the property on the transport route. A brief stop, a formality of some kind that she suspected the preserve manager had arranged out of understanding rather than procedure. She had stood at the fence and he had stood on the other side of it, and they had looked at each other for a moment that had no official meaning but carried, for her, all the weight in the world. She had put her hand out. He had touched it with his nose. Briefly, then turned and walked toward the trailer. She watched him go. The legal proceedings were not clean. She had expected that. Nothing in Larimer County had ever been clean in the way that institutional processes were supposed to be clean, and a case involving a sitting sheriff, a major regional landowner, and 3 years of documented corruption did not become clean merely because the truth had arrived with documentation. Ironwood's attorneys were expensive and creative. They argued that the contamination was pre-existing. They argued that the property covenants were legitimate instruments. They argued that the aquifer data was contaminated itself, that Daniel's field notes were inadmissible hearsay from a deceased, uncertified observer, that the satellite chip data had chain of custody issues, that the fire investigation should be reopened by an independent panel rather than by the original case being reversed. Some of those arguments partially succeeded. The arson charge required a secondary investigation. The contamination case was stronger but was routed through federal environmental court, which moved slowly. There were 3 months during which Clara received calls from her attorney with news that was not progress and which was not failure, but was the particular limbo of a legal process that was being contested at every step by people with resources. There was one night, a Tuesday in January, when the temperature outside was 11 degrees and the heating system in the house was running on its backup element, and the monthly statement from her bank showed a balance she could not afford to look at directly. When she sat in the kitchen at the same table where she had sat for 30 years and thought seriously about giving up. Not surrendering. Not to Ironwood and not to Gideon Sterling and not to any of them. But giving up on the idea that justice operated on a timeline that a single human being could survive within. She sat with that feeling for approximately 40 minutes. Then she got up, put the bank statement in the drawer, and called her attorney. She said, "What do we do next?" Her attorney told her. She wrote it down. She went to bed. The next morning she got up and did the things she had written down. And the morning after that. This was not heroism. This was not the kind of courage that announces itself. It was simply the daily decision to continue, made over and over again in an empty house on an isolated piece of land in Wyoming, by a woman who understood that the only alternative was to let the people who had killed her husband win. She was not willing to let them win. The federal contamination ruling came in the spring. In her favor, Ironwood's liability was established. The covenant restrictions on her property were voided. The water rights restored. It was not a complete victory. No legal outcome ever is. But it was enough. It was the crack in the wall that let the light through, and once the light was through, the wall could not go back to being solid. They rebuilt the east fence in April. Clara hired 2 men from Harlan's Fork who came recommended by someone she trusted, and they worked for 3 days alongside her, driving posts and running wire in the particular companionable silence of people doing physical work together in good weather. She learned their names. She fed them lunch. On the last day, the younger one said, "My grandfather used to run cattle on the Garza place." Before all of it happened. She said, "I know. I'm sorry." He shrugged, not dismissively, but with the particular acceptance of someone who has processed a loss and is living on the other side of it. He said, "At least people know now." She nodded. At least people know now. The property was not what it had been. It was smaller in certain ways that could not be recovered. She was done pretending otherwise. The east pasture would need another season of work before it would hold cattle again. The finances would take years to fully stabilize. The tax situation had been resolved in large part through the settlement funds from the contamination case, but the case itself was still threading through appeals that her attorney told her would likely continue for another 18 months. None of it was simple. None of it was the clean, storybook restoration of exactly what had been lost. But the well was clean. The federal testing team had confirmed it. The Vance aquifer pulled from a stratum that the shallow contamination had not reached, and with the source point on Ironwood land shut down and sealed under court order, the threat of further degradation was halted. The water was clean. It would remain clean. That meant something she did not have words for, in the way that the most important things resist language. She sat on the back porch on an evening in May, when the sky over the Medicine Bow Range was doing the thing it did sometimes in late spring, holding light in the clouds at a slant that made the whole western horizon look like the inside of something luminous, some enormous lamp of warm amber and pale gold. The pasture grass was coming back in the east. Not fully, but coming. She had coffee. She had Daniel's journal on the table beside her, closed now. She had read it completely, twice, and she kept it there not to read anymore, but because its physical presence was something she needed in the same way you need a specific chair in a specific room, for reasons that have nothing to do with sitting. She was thinking about nothing in particular, or everything in particular. The distinction, at 55, on a May evening with coffee and silence, was not meaningful. Movement on the hill. She looked up. On the rocky ridge above the east pasture, where the slope climbed steeply toward the tree line that marked the boundary of the public land preserve, a shape stood against the last of the sky, black against amber, motionless, watching. She leaned forward in her chair. The shape did not move. It stood on the ridge with the stillness of something that was not concerned about being seen, that had chosen this position deliberately, that was watching the ranch below with the particular attention of a creature that remembered a place. The stallion. He was a mile away at least. She could not be certain. But the shape of him, the weight of the chest, the neck's arch even at this distance, the particular way he held his head, was not something she could mistake for anything else. She stayed still. He stayed still. The light continued to shift and deepen, and the ridge held both of them in it, the woman on the porch and the horse on the hill, in a stillness that lasted until the last of the amber light went dark and the first stars appeared, and the Wyoming night came in clean and cold and open, as it always had, as it always would. She picked up her coffee. She smiled. Clara did not fight back with fire. She fought back with truth, and the truth had been there all along, buried beneath her land, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig. There's something that stays with you about this story. Maybe it's Clara standing at that door while armed men waited outside. Maybe it's Daniel, alone in that barn, writing down what he knew while there was still time to write it. Maybe it's a black horse running toward the only clean water left in 60 miles. Whatever it was that hit you hardest, leave it in the comments. Tell me what you felt. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe that what belongs to the land cannot be taken by force, only borrowed, until the land takes it back, then you know exactly why this story needed to be told. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. The well is still running.